Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for all being here today. I'm really excited to welcome you to What's My Lab Do. Today we're having Professor Megan Boudewyn, who will be sharing some information about the research going on in her lab. A variety of her lab's research focuses on language comprehension, attention, and various cognitive neuroscience methods. So as she presents today, you can feel free to drop any questions or comments that you may have in the chat. But we'll also have time for a Q&A towards the end. So be sure to stick around for that. And with that, I'll hand it over to Professor Boudewyn.
Sounds good. Thanks. And thanks for having me. Let me just set up my PowerPoint. All right. So just want to check that you can all see my screen. Should have a little brain with slug ears on it in honor of being here at UCSC. So thanks so much for having me. I think this is a really great series to kind of find out what's happening behind the scenes of a lot of the professors in the department. So I'll kind of jump in. I thought I would maybe start with just a little bit of background and how I got here, how I arrived at UCSC, what my education was like. So I did my undergraduate at UC Davis. I've got a little cow here because Davis is sort of famously the Aggies. Lots of cows in agriculture in Davis. My majors were Spanish and psychology, and then I minored in linguistics. So I had this strong interest in language, generally, how it works, how different languages, pretty much any angle about language was just fascinating to me. Um, After my undergrad, I went to graduate school. This time I've got a little EEG cap on the Aggie symbol there, just because that's when I really started doing a lot of electrophysiological research, which we'll talk about. It's the study of brain waves and cognition. So I got my master's and PhD also at Davis. Then stayed at Davis, but switched over from the psychology department to the Center for Neuroscience for postdoctoral training. Postdoctoral training is sort of optional. It's kind of along the lines of after medical school, you might go get some specialized training at a residency. Similarly, after getting a PhD, you might do some postdoctoral training to pick up additional methods. In my case, I started doing a lot of work with clinical populations during my postdoc and got some extra training there. And then I stayed at Davis one more time for a short stint as a research scientist at the medical center. So I've got a lab coat added on to my little Aggie there with the EEG cap. So during this time, I was sort of faculty, but not teaching really. I was doing a lot of just experiments. I was in the lab most of the time. And then in 2020, I came to UC Santa Cruz and started up the cognitive neuroscience lab here, which we'll talk about. So I've got my little banana slug icon there. Um, so once at Santa Cruz, I thought it might be useful just to kind of talk about the different roles that a professor has before diving into the research itself. So we break our work up into research, teaching, and service. So research is really what I'm going to talk about today most of the time. So as part of my research here, I'm the director of the Cognitive Neuroscience Lab. I spend a lot of time in the lab, sort of designing and conducting experiments, publishing research findings. That's sort of the bulk of my week, I would say. And then teaching is another really important part of what I do here as a professor. I teach about 3 undergrad classes each academic year and 1 graduate class each year. And then kind of this under this umbrella, I also train PhD students and mentor undergrad research assistants who are coming through the lab. And then service. So this would include a variety of things like serving on a department committee. So for example, as PhD students come into the lab, you might serve on their advisory student exam committee, or you might serve on a committee about the undergraduate curriculum. This also includes things like reviewing papers for scientific journals. I usually do 1 or 2 of those a month as well. Um, So to kind of dive into the lab, I wanted to do a little bit of a big picture overview, and then I'm going to give a specific example. So current research topics in the lab, as you mentioned, language comprehension, really interested in a lot of aspects of language comprehension, how the brain supports language processing, how we arrive at sort of a complete understanding of something that we read or listened to. I'm also really interested in attention lapsing. So even if we want to, we don't always pay attention all of the time to a given task. Sometimes our attention waxes and wanes. Sometimes we're aware of that. We know that we're kind of not fully paying attention, and other times we don't. We're actually kind of thinking about something and then realize, oh, wait, I've been drifting off. So I'm really interested in that process. Cognitive control, we'll talk more about in the specific study I want to cover today. This generally refers to our ability to sort of flexibly allocate cognitive effort or resources or attention so we can kind of choose what our goals are and what to be working on. And then I also look at cognition in a lot of major mental health disorders, such as schizophrenia. So I kind of mentioned in my training that I did some work at the UC Davis Medical Center. That's where I worked in the context of a clinic focused on a variety of disorders with early psychosis, including schizophrenia. And I still maintained a lot of those collaborations now, and I'm still working on that. And then my primary method is electrophysiology. So this is our current lab manager who kindly modeled the EEG cap. So in one of our studies, you might come into the lab, be fitted with a cap like this. Leah's wearing 32 electrode channels, and then the readout, what we're looking at, is off to the right. So it looks like all these squiggly lines, and that's actually a representation of brain activity. And what we can do is look at the EEG activity while you're doing a task. So all these tasks on the left, language comprehension, attention, all these different cognitive tasks, we can look at what the brain activity looks like while you're working on those things. So just a little bit about the structure of the lab in terms of personnel. So I've got a couple of current pictures of most of the current team here. It's hard to get everybody together at the same time. So I'm the principal investigator, PI, and then there's usually graduate students. Right now we have 4 graduate students in the lab. Nathan Keynes, Angela Montiel, Ashley Rosenfeld, and Yachi Zhu. And then our lab manager, Leah, who you saw in the previous picture, is a current undergraduate here at UCSC. And then we have undergraduate research assistants. So I have some current assistants in the lab listed here. Most of these students are taking 194 units, which we can talk about more also. This is an advanced research study course. It's a 5-unit course, and then you basically do research rotations in the lab. Um, and then collaborators at other institutions. So I've just listed institutions here rather than individuals. Most of these folks are people who are working on clinical projects. So they're either clinical psychologists or psychiatrists or medical doctors, and so I work with them. My role is typically to do EEG, the EEG part of a particular collaborative project with the larger team. So if you are doing a research rotation in the lab or you're enrolled as a student, the working environment is sort of organized into teams. So we have 5 teams right now corresponding to a team led by me, the PI, and then each of the 4 graduate students. Each team has a couple of undergraduate RAs assigned to it. And the reason we do that is that way our research assistants get to sort of go in depth into one project and really get to know that project, learn how to sort of independently work on that project and gain some depth of knowledge. And then each team usually is working on one project at a time, sometimes a couple. And team meetings are weekly. And then we come together as a full lab once a week with project updates and questions. We also discuss scientific papers. So we usually have a reading list that we kind of work through in a given quarter, take turns presenting, celebrate birthdays, fun stuff too. So a sample week as a research assistant in the Cogneuro lab. Lab activities are usually around 13 hours. The reason, if that seems like a very specific number, it's because usually people are taking that 194 course, and the 5 units breaks down to about 15 hours. That's where that number comes from. It doesn't always have to be exactly 13 hours, but just as a ballpark. And lab activities would include experiment development. So it kind of depends on what aspect, what stage of a project your team happens to be working on in a given quarter. So if you're at the very beginning of a given project, your team might be doing a lot of experiment development, getting the task ready, making stimuli, doing some literature review. If your project and your team is in a data collection phase, you might be spending a lot of time learning how to administer EEG experiments, how to put that cap on, check the signals, learn what it looks like when it's a good connection versus a bad connection. And then if your team is sort of closing down a study, you might be doing a lot of data processing, learning how to work with EEG data once it's already been collected. And then that time includes like preparation for meetings. So maybe reading some papers that we're going to discuss or something like that. And then team meetings are usually about an hour, sometimes less. And then lab meeting is usually a full hour because we're usually kind of going around the room, updating with projects, and then talking about papers. All right, so I wanted to get into a little bit of a sample of the science that's going on right now. So I'm going to just briefly highlight a couple of lines of research, and they're kind of like would correspond to projects on different teams. And then I'm going to cover one in more detail. So one current research question in the lab is, how does attentional state impact language comprehension? And I mentioned this before that, our attention fluctuates. We all know what it's like to sort of realize that you've zoned out. Even if, imagine you're reading something and you actually really enjoy it, but you still find yourself thinking about something else sometimes, right? Or imagine you actually maybe don't enjoy what you're reading. You're trying to read it because you need to study for something and you're distracted. So in this little sample here, one of our paradigms is we have people either read or listen. And every now and then we just interrupt them and ask, right before we interrupted you, were you totally on task? Were you zoned out, meaning you maybe didn't even realize it until we asked, but actually you were thinking about something else? Or were you in a split attention state, which we define as you kind of were half listening or half reading, like you knew you were thinking about something else, but you were also sort of trying to pay attention. And people, we tell people, just to be honest, we're just interested in studying this. And then afterwards, we look at how people do on like a multiple choice test, for example, about what they were reading or listening to. And this is the rate of incorrect responses, and specifically the rate of people saying, I have no idea about a multiple choice test. It's pretty low while the information that the question was asking about, people said they were on task earlier. So this would be like an hour before when you first heard this information and we asked, you said you were on task. You're pretty likely to get that question right later. So that part's not that surprising. What's really interesting is we found this now in a lot of studies. So we've replicated this. People are almost just as bad when they're zoned out as when they're in that split attention state. So we really overestimate, I think, our ability to kind of half listen or divide our attention. We think we're half listening, but then later we perform just as poorly on a test as when we were truly completely zoned out. So that's something we've been following up on and is really interesting to me, because we initially thought Maybe split attention would be kind of in the middle, right? Split, you're half listening, but it does seem to be sort of detrimental to comprehension. So that's sort of one line of research. A related line of work is given this interest in attention and attention changes, how can we develop tools and use EEG to track changes in attention to a cognitive task? So this is just some plots showing so at the top and the bottom, those squiggles, those are raw EEG signals. And without going into too much detail, what you might be able to spot is that on the bottom, there appears to be this very regular looking rhythm that's there. And on the top, it doesn't really seem to be there as much. These are just two different segments of time. The blue colors right below that top bit of EEG correspond to low activity in this particular rhythm, this frequency band. It's called alpha rhythm, corresponds to about 8 to 12 hertz. Hot colors on the bottom correspond to there being a lot of this rhythm in the bottom sample. And what we've found is that changes in this particular frequency band, if you're recording brain activity while somebody's doing a task, seem to correlate to people's self-report of their attentional state. So you can look at times in the task when somebody said they were on task versus zoned out, and you can compare their EEG signal to those two conditions and find changes in this frequency band. So that's another line of work that's really active. And then a third line of work is looking at non-invasive brain stimulation. So there's a technique called TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation, where you apply a very mild electric current. It's about the amount in an LED light. It's very mild, but you're basically trying to sort of upregulate cortical circuits and trying to look at how that impacts performance on cognitive tasks. So we have a line of work where we're trying to stimulate the prefrontal cortex, which has a strong association with attention and cognitive control and sort of performance improvements, and look at how that changes both the EEG signal and also performance on cognitive tasks. So I wanted to kind of pick one sample project and go in a little bit more detail, and also with a goal of highlighting contributions of undergraduate research assistants to this project. So I've kind of got it broken down into the stages we took with this project, and at each stage, how undergraduates in the lab helped. So for this one project, the spotlight is on language and cognitive control research. So I kind of broke this into step one would be developing your research question and experimental design development. And research trainee contributions at this stage would be literature review, so finding relevant published studies that have already come out, starting to pull them together and figure out what is the background for this study, what do we already know as a field, and what are the open questions, and then some brainstorming. So an example of how this might look, we might have a lab meeting discussion or a team meeting where we review papers that show and kind of point out, humans can really flexibly guide our behavior according to current goals. So this is something that we know we can do this. Cognitive control is sort of the term for some of the mechanisms by which we are doing this. We might read some papers about cognitive control, what it is, how it's implemented. And this might lead us to some more specific points. So then we might talk about how cognitive control enables us to perform tasks even in the face of conflict. And conflict could come in a variety of ways. So for example, imagine you are trying, this might be a throwback to elementary school. Imagine you're trying to solve a math problem and somebody is distracting you by saying random numbers. Has anyone ever had this happen to them in their childhood or even now? This is just, one example, but the idea would be there's this conflict, like why is that hard? The reason it's hard is you're trying to focus on the relevant set of numbers to solve your math problem, and you've got these interfering irrelevant numbers that are kind of competing, right? So to solve that, you need to ignore one and pay attention to the other. So that's what I mean by conflict. And you can think of other examples too, right? So there's a lot of conflict involved in, let's say you mistakenly press the wrong button of something. You know what you were supposed to press, but then you know what you actually pressed, and those things are not matching. The thing you did is not the thing you intended to do. That would also be a situation where we would kind of use cognitive control to fix our error, to adjust our processing so that we don't make an error again. So then in our little research question development team, we would maybe look at some other studies to look at, well, what does the EEG literature have to say about this? Do we know what it looks like when somebody's engaging in cognitive control? And it turns out there's a lot of work out there showing that a particular rhythm is really associated with that kind of cognitive control when you do have that conflict between like the error I made and the thing I was supposed to do, or somebody's shouting numbers at me and I'm trying to solve a math problem. So we might put all that together and then make a little brainstorming jump. So what about language? Language contains a lot of conflict. It's maybe a different kind. So for example, ambiguous words have multiple meanings. Like the word ball could mean like the thing that you kick. It could also refer to like a fancy kind of old-fashioned party, right? And those two meanings, which one is the one that's intended is going to depend on the context. So that you could think of that in some ways as kind of related to this conflict idea of like, there's two possible things that are active, only one is right. Kind of like in the math example, I need to choose the right one for this context. So we're getting towards the development of a research question. So do general cognitive control mechanisms, the same kind of thing that we use to fix our incorrect button response or solve a math problem when we're being distracted, is that the same kind of mechanism that gets engaged when you process language? And then how would we test that question? So that would take us to what I would consider to be step 2. So we've got our question, we've done a lot of literature review, and so now our team is going to start to prepare the experiment. So we would need to figure out a specific way to test it. And in this particular study, we worked on this as a group. So we had 2 tasks. One, sort of a basic cognitive control task featuring conflict. So for example, if you read the word blue and it's printed in blue, and you're supposed to respond to what color it's printed in, not what it says, there's not really any conflict there, right? They're the same. It's printed in blue and it says blue. That is usually pretty easy for people to do. They're really accurate at doing that. They're really quick at doing that. The conflict condition would be something like this. The right answer here is red. The word is printed in red, but the word says green, right? So people tend to slow down with that kind of stimulus, and you tend to make some more errors than you might otherwise. And the explanation for that would be there's more cognitive control needed. You have to like ignore one thing to choose the right answer. And previous work has shown there's theta oscillation, so that's that EEG brain rhythm associated with that. So what we did in this study was participants completed that classic sort of basic cognitive control task that has been done before. It's the one on the left where they're answering about the color of the font. And then they also did a language task, and this we developed in the lab. So we tried to use the same kind of thing, but make the conflict only have to do with language. So a sentence like, the party was by invitation only. There's no conflict there. But a sentence like, the ball was by invitation only. It's not a terribly difficult sentence, right? So people are going to be accurate at this. But if you think about listening to this or reading it, the ball was by. Pretend you don't know about invitation only yet. There's a moment in time where you might assume they're going to say something like the goalpost or the basketball court or something, the other meaning of ball, right? When you get to invitation, your brain kind of does this for you. Your brain fixes that and revises it to say, actually, that's not the meaning of this sentence. We're going with the party meaning of this word. And so that is our conflict condition. It's a subtler manipulation in the language task, right? You might not have immediately kind of felt like there was anything wrong with that sentence. But that's kind of our question is the brain sort of exerting some cognitive control when we encounter things like this? And is that also associated and supported by theta oscillations, like something like the word green printed in red? And I'll keep an eye on the chat if you have any questions. So research trainee contributions, generating these experimental stimuli. So that was quite a task, and we had a team working on that. They were kind of fun to write. You can't just test like one sentence. Typically, you need a whole bunch of sentences, and you're going to be using them in a task and recording EEG in response to a whole bunch of different sentences in each condition. So we started with the team found a bunch of words like this, and there's published papers showing like these different ambiguous words. They found words that were strongly biased towards one meaning. So like ball is more commonly in the context of like a game, like a thing you would throw or kick, than the party invitation. And then they wrote sentences around them so that the first part of the sentence is consistent with the dominant meaning. So the ball was by does not rule out the game meaning of ball. And then they had a specific word that sort of made it so you had to pick the other meaning. So invitation would be that word here. And then they did a lot of pilot testing. So they generated a lot of these stimuli, we tested them, and then we got the task set up for recording, tested it out. Usually we test it in the lab first, and then we bring in participants to test. And then we were ready for data collection. So here's Leah again at the EEG desk. So research trainees contributed to a lot here as well. So this is the lab on the left, these back rooms. You can kind of see them in the picture on the left. Those are the EEG booths. So research trainees would have greeted participants, explained the procedure, set up the cap, monitored everything while they were recording. And that would have taken probably a couple of quarters. I think we ended up with something like 40 participants. So that was a significant amount of work for the team during those quarters. And here's what the signal looks like while you're recording. And then you've got your data. You now need to analyze it. So these are all just screen caps meant to kind of evoke like a day in the life of a research trainee in the lab. So you would have your data, you'd be examining it. So I've circled in red here, like these would be sort of problems in the data. You'd have to kind of figure out which segments had problems in them or not. This is just a little screen cap of some software. And then on the right, this is like a bird's eye view of some EEG. These screens would all become really familiar to people if they start working in the lab. And I should mention, these are all, not things that research assistants necessarily would come in knowing about. This is something we would provide training in so that you could learn this on your own. So you would do quality control and processing, and then learn how to do maybe some basic stats or maybe some plotting. How would you plot the data? Those would also be things that the team would help work on. And then this is, I think they're all fun parts. This is probably my favorite part, the results and interpretation. So what was the answer to our question? So it turns out, as hypothesized, EEG activity when you're hearing or reading sentences like the ball was by invitation only, which has this ambiguous word, a word that has two meanings, compared to the ball was by compared to the party was by invitation only is what it should say on the bottom. You do see this difference. So what you're looking at here, 0 here, is when the disambiguating word started. So the disambiguating word is invitation. So prior to that, you've kind of got a particular meaning in mind. You hit invitation, and now in the top one, you have to make a revision. Like you might have assumed it meant one thing, and now it means this other thing. You have to focus on and choose the correct meaning. And again, the ball on the bottom should be party. And so what you basically see here, this big red signal, those are those theta oscillations. So that rhythmic brain activity in a particular frequency band that's really strongly associated outside of language studies with cognitive control, sort of difficult stimuli, situations where you have to ignore one thing, focus on the other. You see that also in language, and it's reduced in the other condition here. So on this scale, bigger is increased, more rhythm. And then on the right, this is sort of the electrodes where it was the largest. So yellow here would be sort of, this is a bird's eye view of the signal at the scalp. So the little triangle is the nose, here's the ears. So looking down, the signal is very frontal. And the reason this was important for us is because this signal looks very much like the signal you might find in a non-linguistic conflict experiment, which is kind of what our question was do you see this in language as well? So research trainees, we discussed this interpretation as a team, went back to our literature review, reread some papers, compared our findings, presented preliminary findings at conferences, and then published the findings. So this came out earlier this year. This is a paper from January. Here's a poster we presented at a Cognitive Neuroscience Society conference about a year before the paper came out. And then I'm on the paper, and then these three authors are all trainees in the lab. So that was something that we did as a group. So I just kind of wanted to walk through the different steps. I've got them all here. And really the big point, I think, for our purposes is research trainees really contribute to every stage of research, from the literature review, finding out what's been done before. That's really important. Brainstorming all the way through preparing the actual experiment, testing it out before you run it, conducting the experiment, learning how to apply the electrodes, processing the data, doing quality control inspections, interpretation, and publishing and presenting. So if you're interested in joining the lab, you can find more information and apply here. My lab website is boudewynlab.ucsc.edu, and then /join has more information and application. And I'll maybe in there and take questions. Okay, so I see some populating in the chat. Oh, great. I'll read the question aloud, which might be helpful, especially for the recording. So currently a first-year cognitive science major and planning to minor in computer science. I'm particularly focused on the way humans learn in order to accurately gauge an AI model and improve it. What would you recommend I should learn to better contribute to your lab? What skills and courses do you look for when selecting applicants for your research lab? So thank you for the question. So I think people come into the lab with a big variety of skills. So some people, it sounds like you have some computer science skills already, and that's awesome. But a lot of people don't, and that's okay. You don't necessarily have to take any particular course or already know how to do anything. I think the biggest thing we look for is sort of like a curiosity about the topic. And also I think one of the things that is most helpful is just sort of being self-motivated. I think in any kind of research setting, and the research assistant positions are true of this as well, there's a lot of sort of choosing your own adventure with what to work on, right? So like kind of if you think about those stages of a project, if you're working on developing the stimuli, or if you're working on, interpreting, I think it's just sort of sticking with it. Research comes with, sometimes you might get stuck on one step for a while, and that's okay. But I think just sort of being self-motivated is the biggest thing I would look for. Let me know if you want any elaboration on that? Do you accept applications for people graduating this year but staying in Santa Cruz? So we do. The typically in that scenario, we've had a few people in the lab who've wanted to volunteer and not take the units. There's some extra paperwork that goes with it because you just have to like register as a volunteer. But we have done that before. Do research assistants typically start working with you at the beginning of a new school year, or do they often join throughout the year? That's a really good question. So theoretically, we could have people join at any quarter. I would say most years there's the largest group of new people come in the fall, only because I think typically people will stay. So we ask for about a 2-quarter commitment. A lot of people stay for longer. And the reason we ask for that commitment is just it's sort of mutually beneficial. It's helpful for you, your first quarter in the lab. You're learning a lot of new things. And I think by the time you're in your second quarter, you're able to do more things independently. But a lot of people stay on beyond that. It's optional, but many people do. So a lot of times in spring, you have a large group who are graduating, which then opens up a lot of spots for the coming fall. But you do have open spots in winter and spring too. So I typically check the applications towards the end of each quarter and then get in touch with people basically and set up interviews, usually during like the finals week of the quarter before they might start. And then over the summer, like right before the school year starts. Um, are you currently accepting new people for fall quarter? Yes, I am. So if you go to boudewynlab.ucsc.edu, I could put it in the chat as well. And then there's a tab, join. That's where the application is, and I check it basically like at the end of each quarter and at the end of the summer. Here, I'll put it in the chat. There's a question in the chat about summer positions. So we are open in the summer. I'm here. The graduate students are here. Some of the research assistants stay in the summer. Typically, people don't opt to do a 194 unit in the summer. You can, but summer units come with kind of separate tuition, and so and it's also just a slower time for research. So usually people who are kind of already in the lab, if they want to hang around the summer and they want to do some volunteer work, they're welcome to, but if not, we just pick up in the fall. What has been your favorite research project at UCSC so far? Thanks for the question. So I would say the project I just mentioned to you, where we were looking at the language processing and theta oscillations, I think it was part of the reason I picked it for this was it was completely conducted from start to finish here at UCSC. We started it at the brainstorm stage here with UCSC students, and then UCSC students helped collect the data, and UCSC students helped analyze it. So it's maybe my favorite just because it was completely conducted here and from kind of start to finish. But I enjoy all of the projects in the lab. The different teams right now are working on a variety of things. There's a really interesting project looking at speech production errors right now in the lab where they have their team has a tongue twister tasks. So participants are actually trying to quickly pronounce tongue twisters. You make a lot of mistakes. And then we're looking at neural stimulation of the prefrontal cortex, which is supposed to support sort of error monitoring to see if you can improve or make fewer errors on this task. That's really exciting. There's some other really interesting work looking at predictable words and how the brain might predict upcoming words in context using EEG. So those are other kind of favorites. So just kind of looking at the chat, how long of a commitment, how many quarters would you look for from an undergrad? So typically I recommend starting with a 2-quarter commitment just because that first quarter there's just a lot of stuff you're learning. So I think people get the most out of it if they have at least 2 quarters. Um, is 194 requirement to apply? It's not a requirement. Not everyone necessarily wants the 194 units. I would say probably like 95% of people do, partially, I think, because you get that transcript notation that shows you took the advanced research units, but it's not a requirement. I'm really interested in your work with patients with mental health disorders like schizophrenia. How do you get into this area? Were there any interesting or surprising findings? Yeah, thank you. So I am not a clinician myself. I got into this area while I was in graduate school. I started looking at just variability in language processing based on things like attention and cognitive control, and started working with some clinical collaborators who what I really learned was disorders like schizophrenia, I think, are sort of well understood as involving sort of differences in perception or like, for example, hallucinations. But there's also a lot of cognitive differences too, like in attention or memory processes, language. And so that's kind of where I started, is the differences in language and attention. And I think one of um, there's been a lot of interesting findings. I think one of the surprising findings is sometimes the differences are really subtle. I think there's sort of like a stigma or like a common misconception that sort of like there's going to be difficulties sort of across the board. And that's not always the case. There's sometimes, really specific changes, but a lot of times they're really nuanced. Would new applicants be able to start lab training early by volunteering this summer if accepted for fall? So yeah, so typically people coming in for the fall, I will reach out to people who applied like probably early September or so. And then I usually do send out just like paperwork stuff, or for example, all research personnel at any stage, students, faculty, staff, you have to complete ethics training and sort of be listed as approved research personnel at the university. So that process can take some time because there's just some like online trainings that go with that. I typically do send those out as early as I can to people, just so that they can do them and kind of start fall without having to wait for that. I'm really interested in how your lab studies naturalistic language comprehension. Could you share some ways you approach balancing ecological validity with controlled demands of EEG experiments? Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you for that. So, one of the cool things I think about EEG is you can record EEG and look at what your brain is doing while you're just like listening, for example, and you don't necessarily, it can be very naturalistic. Like you can just play a podcast or a recording of a lecture or something like that. And actually, one of the students in my lab right now is interested in doing just that. They're working on their team is working on um, podcast stimuli and also conversations, and they're going to have people listen to the podcast and have different language stimuli in there. So that's intended to be very naturalistic and not very like far away from what you would really be doing listening in real life. I think sometimes, though, you have to sort of get things into an experiment. So, for example, um, when we were talking about conflict, sometimes those tasks maybe feel a little bit unnatural, like read the word green, but it's in red font, and when do we actually do that? So I try really hard to kind of think about examples in real life where you might be doing something like that along those lines. And I think it's just important to remember that even if the experiment isn't something you might be doing in real life, it's tapping into like the process you would use in real life. So kind of like that, somebody's saying numbers and you're trying to do a math problem, even that doesn't happen all the time. But on a small scale, all the time, we've got information coming at us, right? We have like texts happening while we're listening, while we're reading, while we're talking. And we're often in this situation of trying to ignore something or some subset of things to attend to some other subset of things. So I think the process is really broadly relevant. Um, I'm going to be an RA next year. I've accepted the lab online trainings. So online training, I'm referring to the IRB. So any kind of research study has to be approved by the ethics board at a given institution, so the institutional review board. And they have what's called city training, and it's basically a set of research ethics training that everyone does. So that's what I was referring to. So Psych 194 registration, that would be something. So Psych 194 is, it's, you get an enrollment code basically from the professor. So it's not like a regular enrollment class. So you wouldn't have to register for it now. Most people register for it at the beginning of the quarter that they're, starting. Are most of the undergrads who work in the lab upper class? So actually, no. I would say we have a pretty good mix of like second year, third year, fourth year. I think it's we have had first years start in the lab. I think it's hard for first years to um, a lot of first years don't know about it, but we have actually our current lab manager, Leah, is now a fourth year, but started as a first year. So we definitely do work with people kind of at any stage. And you don't that kind of to that end, you don't necessarily have to have like a lot of prior experience. We provide a lot of training. Are the hourly commitments fully in person? No, they're not always. So it kind of depends what your research team is working on. So for example, if you're in a data collection phase, that's going to pretty much be in person because you're actually greeting participants, you're running EEG studies. Those aren't really things that are easy to do remotely. But if you are doing a lot of literature review or analysis, sometimes people do parts of that remotely. And we can kind of work with people on an individual level too. So sometimes you might have more or less ability to work in person. I'm currently taking psycholinguistics, Ling 171. In your opinion, how similar or different are the subjects in a linguistics-focused psycholinguistics class to a psych or cod-sci focused class like Psych 125 in your lab? That's a great question too. So, I mean, to some extent, there's going to be some variability. I think there is a degree of overlap. So psycholinguistics, Ling 171 and Psych 125, there are certain topics you probably will see in both. So for example, syntax and grammar and how we process that. I think the theories are different and the methods are different. So in like Psych 125 or a Psych Cog-Sci approach in general to studying language, is usually really firmly rooted in what we know about how the brain supports a given process. Whereas in linguistics, you might have an experimental linguistics approach, but you also might have a lot of just sort of theoretical linguistics without necessarily looking at experimental ways of addressing the questions or looking at the brain data. But it varies. There are a lot of people in our linguistics department here who do work on very similar and overlapping questions. At the moment, I'm taking an online bootcamp for Python as well as CSE 30 to develop more general technical skills to succeed in a lab. The application mentions Python and MATLAB as potential tools. Are there any specific tools used within each, such as EEG lab? Yeah, that's a great question. So we do use Python and MATLAB as both are used in analyzing data. You don't necessarily need to know anything about Python and MATLAB, though. We've had a lot of people learn that in the lab. EEG Lab is a specific toolbox within MATLAB that we do use if you're interested in kind of poking around with it, there's a lot of open source tutorials and stuff online. So we do use that, but you definitely don't have to come in already knowing that. Other question is, do you see opportunities to combine EEG with eye tracking or other measures? Yeah, there's actually the Hoverson lab does some of that combination EEG and eye tracking. There's some really interesting work just because I'm interested so much in attention and changes in attention during comprehension. There's some really interesting eye tracking work that looks at the dilation of your pupil as sort of a proxy for attention or attentional engagement. You can use an eye tracker for that in combination with EEG. I haven't done that work myself, but I read a lot of those papers just because they're interesting and might be interested in doing that in the future. If accepted upon a commuting, how are the in-person meeting times set? So in general, the way our schedule works, me and the lab manager before the beginning of every quarter, we send out a bunch of polls to get everybody's availability. And then we do a giant, it's like a puzzle. Like we try to align, that's how the teams are typically formed. So we do ask, like, if you have a particular topic you're interested in, we'll try to kind of put you on that team. But then another factor is availability. So, like, if your availability is completely opposite from the team leaders, then you'd probably just be better on a different team where your availability lines up. So it's set every quarter, honestly, based on just the large lab meeting with everybody together. We try to find like a magical time when 100% of the people can attend. Every now and then we find one where almost everyone can attend, and then we work around that. But yeah, it's just dependent on the quarter because everybody's schedule changes every quarter. It's a challenge, honestly. Do you have any advice for students interested in pursuing a lab on campus but unsure what subfield they would like to pursue, developmental, cognitive, or social? Yeah, and I think that can be really daunting. Like if you're interested in getting into research, but like maybe you don't know exactly what kind of research you might find interesting. So I would say two things. I would say first, um, sometimes something surprises you. You maybe, if you're not sure, sometimes just getting involved to see if you like the research process in general, because I think any lab is going to have in common sort of those general steps of like brainstorming and researching what people have done before, designing and conducting the experiment, and the techniques will be all different. But just to see if you like that process, I think you could probably get at that first question in almost any lab. And then in terms of like trying to narrow things down, if there's a class you've taken with a professor and you really liked it, I would follow up with them. You could email them or check out their website, see if they have a application. Um, if you go to the faculty page, almost everyone has a link to papers they've published. So you could maybe just, you don't necessarily have to, it's a lot of a commitment, I think, to read in depth a bunch of papers. But if you just look up like maybe the most recent publication and just glance through the abstract to see like, is that something that sounds interesting? Do the topics sound interesting? Do the methods sound interesting? That can maybe help you narrow it down. And then also to keep in mind, like it's really common, let's say you start in a lab and you actually do really like the research process, but along the way you realize you're in a developmental lab, but actually really think social is great, or you're in a social lab, but actually you're really interested in memory or something. Um, that's partly some of the value of that process is like learning what you like, what you're interested in. And you can also kind of switch labs and move around. We've definitely had people start with me and move on to a different lab, or start in a different lab and come work with me. There's a lot of that on campus. Have you ever specifically worked with individuals with ADHD and how attention levels vary compared to neurotypical attention in research on language and cognitive control? So I myself haven't done a lot of work specifically on ADHD, but it is a huge topic in attention and cognitive control research. And I have a lot of collaborators who have done a lot of that work. There's some really interesting EEG data, just looking at variability in general across people in the markers of attention, in changes in attention. There's some really interesting stuff too with comparing this idea of zone out and not aware of being zoned out versus being aware of zoned out, and just variability. People vary widely in their ability to kind of monitor their own attention. Not everyone's the same, and the markers are not all the same. So yeah, I haven't done a lot of it myself, but there is a really big literature on that question. Really interested in strengthening future PhD application, especially in areas related to your lab's work. Do you have any general advice on building a stronger application profile over the next couple of years? Yeah, I mean, I think the more research experience probably that you can get for a PhD application is the best thing to try and do. So if you haven't already been working in a lab, trying to maybe start working in a lab. You can also maybe start looking at like particular future programs and maybe see like what types of methods are useful. And you don't necessarily have to have experience in a particular method to be a strong candidate. Like, so for example, if you're interested in going to graduate school and doing neuroimaging work, you don't necessarily have to have already done neuroimaging work, right? Like, that's hard to come by, and your institution might, like, for example, our institution doesn't have an MRI scanner. But I think having just sort of research background is a good thing to have if you're interested in graduate school, uh, and sort of a grasp of like the questions you want to answer, I think. And you don't necessarily have to have it right now, but you mentioned building over a few years. I think working up towards that is maybe the goal. These are all great questions. What makes this cognitive science, neuroscience lab different from other cog sci labs on campus? So every lab is going to have a little bit of a different focus. In our department, and our campus, we have a few different labs that use this technique, so EEG that I was mentioning, but we all kind of use things in different ways. So I do what I try to think of like the best way to describe what unites all of the research questions I'm interested in. And the thing I always think about is sort of high level cognition. So like pulling from different cognitive areas. So if you're in a language comprehension situation, like you're listening to a lecture or you're reading a book, but then we're looking at like attention layered on top of that. That's the kind of thing that my lab does a lot of, is sort of the combination of things, or cognitive control and language. Other labs, so there's some labs in our department that do like the Samaha lab also does EEG work, but does a lot of perception and decision making. And the questions are very, very different. And even the way that you use the method can be kind of different because it's really tailored to your question. So you can get a really different experience in labs that on their surface might look kind of similar in technique. For example, Jeannie Foxtree's lab is also kind of a language lab, but studies things in a totally different way as well. She does a lot of conversations and dialogue, and production and things like that. I'm doing a lot of sort of comprehension and online processing. So we all kind of have, I think, a different flavor to some extent. Will there be opportunities to present research on campus? Yeah, so we have, there's undergraduate research symposium we've had people present at. We've also had folks present at the Building Belonging end of year presentation. So that's through the Institute for Social Transformation, and they do, if you're interested in that, they have their presentations on research coming up. It's in a couple of weeks. So yeah, there are different venues to present research on campus. We also do a lot of informal presentations to each other or to other labs in the department.
All right. Thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you so much, Megan Boudewyn, for your amazing presentation. We all learned a lot. We have this QR code up here for other posted research opportunities. And yeah, thank you guys all so much for coming. And thank you, Megan, for all your work.
Thanks so much for listening and for all your great questions. This is a really fun presentation.